The Atlantic, Britain's lifeline. Treacherous enough in peacetime, in war, black with menace. U-boat packs stalk through the night, knowing the danger. Their victims still plow on. Ships and cargoes go down. Their crews, some of them, survive. But early in 1943 it is Britain's survival and the Allied hopes for victory over Germany which are in doubt. When war began, Britain saw Germany's big ships as the main threat to her sea trade. So did the Germans. Germany's surface raiders would savage the merchant fleet on which Britain depended for much of her food, most of her raw materials, and all of her oil. Germany's U-boats were to operate in coastal waters, sweeping up anything left by the battleships. Both Britain and Germany were wrong. The real naval menace was to be the U-boat. At least one man knew this, Karl Dönitz, chief of the U-boat arm. He could have been wrong too, if Hitler had delayed his war with Britain until all the battleships planned for the German Navy had been built. As it was, Dönitz was certain that with enough submarines, he could win the war at sea. He had proved it to himself 20 years before.
In October 1918, I was captain of a submarine in the Mediterranean near Malta. In a dark night, I met a British convoy with cruisers and destroyers. And I attacked and I sank a ship. But the chance would have been very much greater if there had been a lot of submarines. That's why the idea of a wolf pack to put the submarines together that they could attack together was very impressive. And that's why in all the years from 1918 until the year 1935, where we had the first submarines again in the German Navy, I never had forgotten this idea.
Underwater, the 1939 U-boat was slow. On the surface, it was faster than any convoy of merchant ships. With its low silhouette, it could not be seen easily, especially at night. But its targets were outlined clearly against the sky. And with radio, the U-boats could quickly assemble into hunting packs. Dönitz knew Britain would try to protect her essential Atlantic trade by a system of convoys escorted by warships. To attack these convoys, Dönitz wanted 300 U-boats. When the war started, he had only 26. And these boats had long, dangerous voyages from base before they could reach their targets. When France fell, Dönitz gained new bases much nearer the shipping routes. His sea wolves returned to these French ports as heroes. One especial hero was Otto Kretschmer. In all, Kretschmer sank over 250,000 tons of British shipping. In October 1940, he joined the first real wolf pack.
I remember that there was a signal that a convoy was coming in from America to England, and that its position was not known, and that Dönitz ordered all the submarines there to the west of Ireland to form a sort of recce line, stationary recce line, to let the convoy pass through. And when the submarine was sighted, the convoy made a signal, its contact signal. This recce line was dissolved automatically, and every boat was free to go in for the attack.
Convoy SC7 on the night of the 17th of October 1940 was passing Rockall. 34 merchantmen, 4 small escort ships. 7 U-boats attacked on the surface.
The attack took the same form as that we were used to, which was a single ship being struck. Very shortly after that, a second one was struck. And then, within a matter of 5 to 10 minutes, further ships were struck.
I tried to get through the escorts into the convoy, which was my own peculiarity of attacking, and failed for the first time. They saw me and shot star shells so that I had to draw away again. But for the second time I succeeded and was inside the convoy, going up and down the lanes and looking for the most important, valuable ships, and had the opportunity to expand all torpedoes. I had 12 in all.
Like you see ships in various stages of sinking. A Dutch ship had stopped and was attempting to pick up survivors. And whilst I actually watched her doing this and was considering what to do about it, she also herself was torpedoed. This, along with another torpedo, set the whole place ablaze.
That night, 17 merchantmen, exactly half the convoy, were sunk. The escorts had not been able to damage a single U-boat.
I don't think I'd ever seen more than one ship sunk at a time before, and this was something very different indeed.
This really was the first time that this tactics could be experienced by all of us, and also by Dönitz himself, who of course knew it only from our peacetime training. And the whole night, I think, was a success. It was called the Night of the Long Knives, because so many ships were sunk.
In the first 9 months of the war, Britain and her allies lost over 2 million tons of merchant shipping. In the next 6 months, with the U-boats operating from France, nearly 2.5 million tons more went down. There were medals galore. U-boat crews called this the happy time.
I saw the ship going up, the stern going underwater, and she upended right up on end and went backwards. And I went down with her. After a bit I came to the surface, and I was still sitting onto the overturned bridge boat, and I saw the submarine servicing. He went down and started picking up cases out of the water. General cargo, possibly spirits, food stuff, and so forth. They looked at us and circled around for a bit. They laughed at us and went away to the northeast. They never asked if we had any water, we had any damages, or anything else. And we were left, floating amongst wreckage in one boat. We're halfway between Brazil and North Africa. The only thing I could think about was trying to get to the land as near as possible, so I set the course as near as I could to the northeast. All we had was the one lifeboat, which was made for 48 people. We picked up 58. There wasn't really room enough for anybody to sit down. The boat was leaking badly through being on the chocks for some time. You had quite a bit of trouble getting the crew to move so you could bail. When you bailed for nearly 2 days, until the wood of the boat started to swell and to tighten up. After that, it wasn't so bad. The worst days, of course, were when there was no wind, absolutely becalmed. The sun was terrific. So we started off by giving 4 ounces of water, 2 ounces in the morning and 2 ounces at night, and 1 biscuit. And there was a lot of noise in the boat. There were Chinese. And I said, what's all the bobbery? Which is a lot of talky-talky, you know? He said, I think number 1 fireman go crazy. So he eventually jumped over the side with a life jacket on. And after a wee while, we got him back again. And later that night in the darkness, he jumped again. We didn't get him back because the sharks got him. On the morning of the 13th, I used to sit on the water barrel to make sure nobody could help themselves. And somebody shook me up and said, hey, Captain, we see lights, green lights. Oh, I said, you're dreaming. And I looked round and I saw some green lights, which looked at me like they were bright and clear. I couldn't make it out. So I said, well, burn a flare. They burned a flare. He said, burn another flare. They burned another flare. And after a bit, I saw the green lights getting closer, more visible. Then after a bit, I saw a red light above the green. And then it dawned on me that it was a hospital ship.
The U-boats had eyes in the air. Focke-Wulf Condor aircraft could range 1,000 miles out to sea to scout for convoys. When used to bomb shipping, the Condors sank 30 ships in 2 months. Luckily for Britain, this partnership with the U-boat was never properly exploited. But Dönitz did exploit the fact that German naval intelligence had broken the British codes.
We were aware that the intelligence for some reason was good, but I myself put this down to very superior hydrophone equipment that the submarines had, that the U-boats had in their boats, probably being able to pick up the noise of a convoy's propellers up to 80 or even 100 miles. But in addition, I know that they would place their U-boats in a line across at right angles to the expected line of the convoy. And this line, for say 5 U-boats, could be 100 miles from end to end. And so with good hydrophones, very little disguise of the position of a convoy could be effected. It was only after the war that we knew that they were breaking the codes and that they knew very well the time of leaving port that the convoys had and how many escorts were and how many merchant ships in each convoy.
The Royal Navy, searching for U-boats underwater, had pinned its faith on Aztec, an echo-sounding device. But U-boats were attacking convoys on the surface. The Navy was not prepared for this.
Convoy defense is not a very glamorous affair, and between the wars, I think rather naturally, the Navy were inclined to concentrate more on more glamorous activities like great massed torpedo attacks and that sort of thing. All the information about the lessons of World War I were available, and for those who wanted to read them, all the lessons were there. But I'm afraid no one bothered. And as a result, trade defense as a whole was very badly neglected.
The neglect continued. In the early days, convoys could only be escorted for about 300 miles from each Atlantic coast. There just weren't enough escort ships. Those available lacked endurance and their crews were virtually untrained.
My officers were 3 R&V officers. One who was a civil engineer by profession. The other 2 were Canadian, staff lieutenants, both of the age of between 20 and 21, who would come from Canada as passengers, and that was their seagoing experience. The heads of department were regulars. Some of them had retired and called back. And there were 2 or 3 seamen who were of the Pucker service, and the rest were straight in.
Air cover was to prove all-important. But surprisingly, the Navy's carriers did not at first supply it. That task went to the RAF, although Coastal Command was ill-prepared.
With the exception of the Sunderland flying boats, a very small number, all the other aircraft, except the ensign, were lash-ups. They were borrowed from entirely dissimilar functions in order to do this job in Coastal Command. Secondly, the navigation aids were not there. It was entirely dead reckoning navigation. And whereas an experienced navigator can look at the sea and estimate the wind and where he's likely to be in an hour's time, this is very difficult for a new boy. And since the point to be navigated to, the convoy, was often equally at error, it was no wonder that we failed to meet many convoys. So lack of equipment, lack of training, and unsuitable aircraft were certainly severe handicaps at the beginning of the war.
What is more, cooperation between the Navy and the Air Force in the field as well as at sea was then very bad indeed, mainly due to stupid quarrels between senior officers in Whitehall. It took nearly 2 years before we had anything like the right sort of cooperation between ships and aircraft. It was a disgrace and a tragedy. So many ships were sunk and so many lives were lost unnecessarily during those first few years.
So seamen suffered from quarrels in Whitehall, from the U-boats, and from the sea.
start by popular request of the Siemens Messdeck, the Western Approaches signature tune.
From one gratified remote, someone invading my dream. He was sailing along, eastward bound. Suddenly something went wrong.
It's very, very hard to describe to someone on the land after a tough convoy. By tough, I mean bad weather, especially in the winter time. What just over 2 weeks at sea is, living on corned beef and hardtack. And this is, it's not a fallacy. We used to do this quite often when the seas come in and put the galley fires out, and you couldn't just cook anything hot. The lucky ones had hammocks, and the unfortunate ones had to lie on the lockers, and it was very discomforting. You used to get chaps coming down from the middle watch, 4 o'clock, wet through, just clambering on the locker, and poor chap who was already trying to get some sleep would get soaked. There was no hygiene there. We really started smelling after about a week if you didn't watch it. We had a feeling that it was a necessary job. I'm not so sure that we realised that it was all that important. To us it was a very boring job. We were on lookout for anything that might come up, and it was bitterly cold. It was an open bridge, open to all weathers, and it was more really trying to keep warm, trying to keep the cold out, trying to keep dry, rather than realise that we were doing an important job.
But they were doing an important job. They brought the cargoes without which Britain could not have kept going.
Then you sit down in the cabin. That's when you really think. Now we're in the open sea. We can catch a packet any moment.
There was many times that we saw little lights in the water, and we assumed that these were survivors, but we couldn't stop and pick them up.
The normal comparison that the seamen made with their wage for the hours that they worked was with the ammunition workers, who were making fabulous amount of money with no more risks than our housewives left at home.
We lost 1 out of every 3 men. And without them, this nation wouldn't have survived more than 3-4 months.
But the Germans were still celebrating. In the first half of 1941, they sank nearly 3 million tons of shipping. Ships were harder to replace than cargoes. If they could be sunk faster than they could be built, Britain would starve. But now the Canadian Navy, tiny at the outbreak of war, was expanding to 50 times its original size. It would take over nearly half the burden of convoy escort in the North Atlantic. More and more convoys were leaving Canada. Decks laden with tanks, holds full of supplies from the neutral United States under Lease Len. Alarmed at continuing losses, the British War Cabinet set up a new Western Approaches Command to reorganize convoy defense. For the first time, the RAF and the Navy worked closely together. And in March 1941, Dönitz lost 3 of his ablest men. Gunther Prien, who had sunk the Royal Oak at Scapa Flow, depth-charged and killed. Joachim Schepke, rammed and drowned. And Kretschmer, depth charged to the surface, and taken prisoner. Only 1/3 of Dönitz's fleet could be on patrol at any one time. His best captains had suddenly gone. Now he could only keep some half-dozen U-boats at sea.
With this small number of U-boats, of course, any decisive success in the Battle of the Atlantic was not possible. That's why it was necessary for the building of submarines to get first place in the German armament plan. But this was not done, in spite of all the requests made by Admiral Raeder, who then was chief of the German Navy.
Worse was to come for him. The United States was still officially neutral.
General quarters, on the double.
But after Churchill's Atlantic meeting with Roosevelt in September 1941, America announced that she would protect ships of any nationality plying between her shores and Iceland. There would now be enough warships to provide continuous escort across the Atlantic. It was time to counterattack.
I got hold of a number of escort commanders who I asked the question, when a U-boat is known to be attacking a convoy, as they do now by night, I asked them what they did. And the answer in most cases was, well, what can you do? It's a very tiny little thing and we can't see them. Radar, of course, in those days was very elementary and we had very few sets. But in fact, there was one escort commander who had the idea, which is still absolutely relevant, that when an attack, of which there is no warning, takes place, that all of the escort should do the same sort of thing on a planned line at exactly the same time, so it has the maximum effect over the broad ocean around that convoy. And this, of course, was the then Commander Walker.
Although he did not survive the war, Walker was to sink more U-boats than anyone else. At the end of 1941, he set a new style for convoy defense. The convoy was HG 76. In it were 36 merchantmen from all parts of the world. They assembled in Gibraltar for the trudge to Britain. The Navy knew there were at least 6 U-boats on the convoy's route. Their signals had been picked up by the Admiralty. When HG-76 sailed on the 14th of December 1941, it had an exceptionally large escort, 17 ships commanded by Walker. Among them, for the first time, an auxiliary aircraft carrier, the Audacity. 3 days out, Audacity's planes spotted U-131. The escorts quickly sank her. Dönitz homed 5 more U-boats on the convoy. Walker's team soon sank one. But that night, the U-boats attacked again. An escort and a merchant ship were sunk. Walker counterattacked. Hitler's own ship rammed and sank U-574. In the air, Audacity's fighters harried the German Condors. One was destroyed, others were damaged. But some of the escorts were running out of fuel. They had to leave. A U-boat penetrated the gap. Audacity was the next victim. Another hectic night followed. The convoy lost one more ship. At Endras, another U-boat ace was sunk in U-567. Next day, for the first time, a long-range Liberator appeared and attacked. Dönitz decided he must withdraw. Walker had justified his tactics. Aircraft had proved their worth. 4 U-boats had been sunk. But Dönitz was about to be given his greatest opportunity. In December 1941, the United States came fully into the war, but left her peacetime lights on. Dönitz U-boats never had it so good. This was the second happy time. The Americans did not have enough warships available for offshore escort, so there were no convoys there. Many ships were convoyed safely across the ocean to be torpedoed alone and unescorted offshore. The slaughter went on. In the second half of 1941, nearly 1.5 million tons of shipping were lost. In the first half of 1942, over 4 million tons of shipping were lost, 1,000 ships. At this rate, the Allies would lose the war.
We had to sink as many ships as possible before our Anglo-American opponent could develop an effective anti-submarine defense and could replace the merchant ships which had been sunk.
But most of Germany's U-boats were not in the Atlantic. They were patrolling off Norway, defending Germany's supply lines, or confined in the Mediterranean. These dispositions infuriated Dönitz. He had no doubts where the U-boats ought to be.
The German submarines must not be used for any other purposes. Their main strategic purpose was to sink as many ships as possible in the Atlantic.
But Hitler and the High Command would not listen. Although preoccupied with the Pacific, the United States naval staff were now willing to rethink Atlantic tactics. They finally established a system of offshore convoys. Sinkings of merchantmen dropped off. Sinkings of U-boats began. Dönitz now switched his boats to the Caribbean, where many ships were still sailing independently. 2 months, 78 ships were sunk, more than half of them oil tankers.
It's a very long time ago, but I can see it now, of the people that lived aft running around on fire and throwing themselves straight over the side into the oil which was on fire all round. In the meantime, I shouted to the remaining people in the boat to get the oars out and try and push her off from the ship's side, because the rivets of the ship's side had burst out and they were on fire. We rowed around for a wee while and we heard some screams for help. And we pulled out of the water a fireman, or greaser as we call them, and he was terribly burnt, so much so that when we pulled him in, the skin of his body and arms came off in our hands like gloves. We set sail and course for Trinidad, where I had a rough idea where it might be. And so we tidied up the boat and set off, but shortly after that, the greaser, who had been in terrible agony all night, he died. And we laid him on the thwart for a wee while, and then shortly after that, the plumber told me that the third steward had died too. So I went to have a look at him, and he was wrapped up in a blanket. And I took the blanket away, and the whole of his stomach was severely damaged and hanging out. He'd been very patient during the night, and the only thing he complained of was cold. So we laid him on the thwart and covered him with a blanket. And for about an hour, because I wanted to really make sure that they were dead, because we had nothing to indicate. Everything I did indicated that they were so. Eventually, after about an hour, we committed them to the deep. Morale in the boat at this time was very low, because these were all young boys, 17, 18, 19, 22. And by this time it was a boatload of miseries, pain, and death.
Only 8 men survived from the San Emiliano's crew of 40. To Allied seamen, the U-boat crews were heartless killers. But the Germans were brave men, too. They needed all their courage when depth charges exploded round them, sometimes for 12 hours at a stretch. 8 of every 10 U-boat crewmen were to die in action. They called their U-boats iron coffins.
The destroyer I met had radar, so he had me on his screen, and with full speed ahead, he rammed me for the first time. And when I saw him, it was too late to dive. I tried to torpedo him, but the distance, 150 yards roundabout, was too close, so the torpedo wouldn't explode. So I tried to get have a bigger distance between the destroyer and the boat. And he was shooting during 1 hour or 2 hours with machine guns. An officer next me was dead, and another officer, he had got a bullet through his throat, and I had got a bullet in my chest, and I had some 30 shell splinters in arm and leg, and a bullet in my head. After 1 hour stress, the sailors were very anxious. And one of the petty officers, he lost his nerves and said, "Oh, this madman, and why don't we surrender?" But this was the only one.
But the time was coming when courage was no longer enough. Radio had remained essential to Wolfpack operations, but new Allied direction-finding equipment could pick up German signals and plot where they came from. With short-wave radar, escorts could now locate a U-boat on the surface, often sighting the U-boat before her crew could see them. The low silhouette was no longer such an advantage.
Light cut off.
Aztec equipment too was improving. Escort ships could track a submerged U-boat as she twisted and turned at low underwater speed. There were new weapons like the Hedgehog for the kill. The Germans did not realize the extent of British and American technical advances, nor did they match them.
The Germans had some very high-class scientists indeed, and some excellent engineers, but they didn't achieve the results they ought to have done. First, I think, because they were mucked around, and the Germans kept altering the priorities. And secondly, and most important, so I don't believe they were ever allowed to take any interest in the operational side, as opposed to what happened with us, where the scientists were made to feel full members of the operational team. And I believe this, much more than the question of weapons and devices, was the reason why the Germans fell so far astern in technological matters.
The Allies themselves were still behind in using what was to prove the most effective counter to the U-boat: aircraft with radar. Convoys could seldom be given continuous long-range air cover. When they were, losses were reduced and U-boat kills increased. The problem was range. Planes now flew to the convoys from North America, from Iceland, from the United Kingdom. But there was a vast gap in mid-Atlantic which these escort planes could not reach. The U-boats could and did. In the second half of 1942, over 3.5 million tons went down, nearly 700 ships, many of them in the Atlantic Gap. To close this gap, escort carriers were needed to sail with the convoys. But few were yet available. Or very long-range planes like the Liberator. But in 1942, the Americans needed most of these in the Pacific. Or Lancaster bombers. But despite Admiralty appeals, the RAF kept them all bombing Germany, although they did release other aircraft.
Bomber Command diverted 6 squadrons to Coastal Command. And if you'd said it would have been better if they'd made that 10, yes it would, but the line had to be drawn somewhere, and as a coastal type I would have liked to have seen a few more squadrons in coastal, but Bomber Command were pitifully short of airplanes too for the job they had to do. Surely, if there had been more Liberators allocated from America, then we could have improved the situation much earlier and have saved the lives of a lot of seamen.
More and more, the war effort depended on the United States. Merchant ships and escorts were mass-produced to carry the material and men for the invasion of Europe. Unless the Atlantic was secured, all else could fall apart. In January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill decreed that the defeat of the U-boat be given top priority. Improved escort vessels were built. There were now enough of these to go over to the attack. But also in January 1943, Dönitz took over as chief of the German Navy. He paid off most of the big ships and released their crews for the submarine service. At last he could have U-boats mass-produced. 17 new U-boats were commissioned each month. By early spring 1943, Dönitz had over 400 U-boats in service. Once again, the convoys might be overwhelmed. In May came what was to prove the decisive battle around convoy ONS-5.
ONS-5 was a rather small, very slow, and of course unladen, empty convoy. And we had a lot of trouble. The weather was very bad, the ships got disorganized, and south of Iceland, after 3 or 4 days, we had several attacks by submarines, most of which we drove off successfully, and only had one ship sunk. Then after a spell, we had a long series of very bad gales indeed, combined with a little nip into the ice pack off Greenland. And at this stage, my ship was running short of fuel. I couldn't fill from the tanker because of the weather, and I had to leave.
So I got the signal from Breton that he had to push off to Newfoundland to get fuel, and would I come back and take over the escort? I didn't say would I said, you're in charge.
May the 3rd. 4 escort ships have left to refuel. In bad weather, 10 merchant ships have lost contact. A line of U-boats is waiting. As they move in on the 4th of May, aircraft from Canada sink one and damage another.
At about 4:45, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the torpedoing started.
I torpedoed 2 ships, each with 2 torpedoes, and one of these ships, it didn't explode, but after the explosion of the torpedoes, another big explosion happened.
I looked back and I saw the captain. I would suggest the bridge was probably, 10 or 15 feet, might be a little more off the water, when he jumped off the wing of the bridge into the sea. And there was a life raft nearby, I know that. Well, I couldn't stop and pick him up. And, it was in, I suppose a matter of half a minute that I got one myself.
Once more, I was lucky by slipping through into a gap between 2 of the escort vessels and closing into the port column of the convoy, and I fired the 2 torpedoes, and both torpedoes hit the target ship.
May the 5th. The U-boats make 25 attacks in 8 hours. More ships are sunk. The outlook for the convoy is grim, as Dönitz orders in still more U-boats.
We picked up quite a lot of signals from other submarines also getting contact to this convoy. And so we thought that this convoy would be absolutely dead during the next night.
Somewhere in the region of 10 o'clock, the attacks started, and they became fast and furious.
Suddenly, dense fog came up, and so it was nearly impossible to find the convoy again. I tried to do it, but we couldn't find the ships again.
Escorts were reporting submarines coming in, not ships being torpedoed. And this, of course, was absolutely, well, it was the first time it ever happened, certainly to me.
Staying on the surface during the dark time now in the dense fog, of course it was very dangerous.
They were coming up all the time saying that the submarine was bearing so-and-so on radar, and then the next thing you've got submarine close alongside, another one, submarine just ahead of me, I'm ramming, and this one went on all night.
I got a very firm ASDIC contact about 800 yards from the nearest ship in the convoy. My immediate reaction, which I think was the correct one, in fact I know was the correct one, was to increase speed and give it a 5-charge pattern straight away to keep the chap's head down so that he would put him off his stroke if he was going to fire torpedoes. But I was short of depth charges at that stage, and I thought the conditions were perfect. The night was relatively calm, a bit of fog, perfect for a deliberate attack. And so I decided to do a deliberate attack with our forward-throwing weapon, the Hedgehog. We saw 2 distinct flashes a few seconds after the Hedgehog bombs hit the water. And as we passed over the position where our Hedgehog bombs had hit the water, we were our bow was virtually lifted from the water as a result of the U-boat breaking apart and escaping air. And there was great exhilaration on the bridge because this was our first kill. We had no feelings at the time, I'm afraid, of destroying 70-odd people. One's emotions, one had control of one's emotions by then, after 3 years of war. And it was just the thought that it's us or them, and on that occasion it was them. May the 6th. Although 11 merchantmen have been lost, the escorts have beaten off the largest wolf pack Dönitz can send against them. 7 U-boats have been sunk, others damaged. Demoralized by their failure to destroy the convoy, with the odds so much on their side, the U-boats withdraw. I think we really felt that at last our training and technology had got on top of the U-boats.
We sailed for the next convoy, SC-130, on the top of the wave. And despite the fact we had a very heavy battle with about 20 U-boats, we sank 3 of them and didn't lose one single ship. In that month, May 1943, 41 U-boats were sunk. One of them, Dönitz, lost his younger son.
In May 1943, the German submarines had lost the operational and tactical quality of surface maneuverability.
They never regained it. Unable to range freely on the surface, the wolf packs were beaten. It was time to celebrate a victory in North Africa and in the Atlantic.
More than 30 U-boats were certainly destroyed in the month of May, foundering in many cases with their crews into the dark depths of the sea. Staggered by these deadly losses, the U-boats have recoiled to lick their wounds and mourn their dead. Our Atlantic convoys came safely through. And now as a result of the May victory and the massacre of U-boats, we have had in June the best month from every point of view we have ever known in the whole 46 months of the war.
The Atlantic lifeline was, at last, secure.